Okay, it's Pipes Drums on April 25th, 2022, and we're going to talk about the topic of size in pipe bands, roster size, section size, maximums, minimums, all kinds of things. And just really delighted to have two of the pipe majors of two of the world's greatest pipe bands. Alex Gandy from the 78th Highlanders Halifax Citadel in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and David Wilton of Police Scotland Fife from Fife, Scotland. So thanks, guys, for taking the time today to share some views with Pipes Drums readers.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we thought, why don't we start with, the pros and cons. David, just kind of thinking about, there are good sides and bad sides to each side of this issue, but maybe why don't we talk about the pros and cons of maximum numbers if associations were to put rules into place about having maximum sizes for pipe bands. What do you think are the pros and cons, David?
I think the pros definitely are that the general consensus would be that the players would filter down. We would maybe get a bit more of an even grade in terms of size of band, and maybe might impact the quality of going down, meaning that perhaps even if not good enough to quite make a band, they might then start looking at playing either in a local band, helping out a local band, or going down grades, and we might find that maybe has an impact. Numbers of bands, size of bands being smaller could increase the number of bands. I think musicality wise, I think it might be easier to really gauge an equal sound or volume, or you can really gauge which band has more impact. If one player band with 18 has a bigger sound than another band with 18, and maybe that would have an impact on a mark from a judge or something like that. You can look at the harmonies. You can maybe get a bit more on a con side, I guess, less intricate with your harmonies, because you've got the volume of those harmonies might overpower the melody, so you might get less intricacies through that. If we're looking at furthering the musical content, you might find that that maybe the con to that would have more of an impact on how well you can play harmonies, how you can layer your harmonies. How deep can you go? So I guess to me, those probably pros and cons. Some of them there for you.
Alex, thoughts come to mind stemming from what David just talked about?
Yes, absolutely. So, the harmony thing is definitely accurate. And I think as far as a more even placement of skill, I believe that would happen. And I think ultimately a major pro is that it just results in a lot more clarity in what we're able to do and what can the judges expect. So it's easier for the judge if you're not thinking, okay, were they that much better? Was it 24, and then visually going on with 17 or 16? It's having a full army march on, it's always quite a bit more daunting than if you've got a sort of a bit more of a sparse crew, which is why you'll notice with bands going on, there's always 7 in the front, even if there's like 10, 5 and 5, and silly things like that. A con, I think, that would be worth mentioning would be the potential stifling of just people wanting to progress. I know for myself, when I was younger, I had dreamed to go over and play in field marshal. Now, would I have been the first one to get in the door if there was a limit on the size? And it was already quite a big band, so maybe not. So selfishly, that would be one thing where I'd think, okay, at that time, I'm definitely happy that there wasn't. But thinking now as the leader of a band, having a more even playing field, and not, the likelihood of my band beating field marshal, pretty slim. But if I know that I've got 18 playing against their 18, at least it's, all right, let's see what I can do. And not that 18 is the right number, you know, I don't know. I mean, another con is that there would be big bands that are potentially having to displace members. So if you've got 26 on your roster and you can only have 21 or 18 or 23 or whatever the magic number ends up being, well, then technically, you know, that's another difficult decision for the leadership of the band, whether it's from the drum corps having to skinny things up, or the pipes or the mids or whoever. The only people safe from this would be the bass drummers.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so I mean, these are really good, interesting points that you've raised. Now, let's say things stayed status quo and there's never any maximum in any grade. What do you think the positives and negatives of that might be, given what we've seen maybe in the last 10, 15 years, the last 2 years notwithstanding? You know, any thoughts about that? Alex, pitch it back to you on that.
Yeah. So with sort of letting the pipe band economy regulate itself, it tends to find that equilibrium. You know, in 2007, that was the year that the Frasers went out, I think, when they had 30 pipers. And I'm pretty confident, I think they were third that year. And it might have been a different result if they went out with their best 21 instead of having that back, you know, call it 33%. It's like because it made it maybe a little muddy. So that experiment, I think it was great. And it was certainly, I don't want to say intimidating, but looking at it is like, wow, that's a monstrous band. And they had so many good guys in there at the time tuning them up and all that. Like it was a massive sound. But I don't know that experiment worked because it never really happened again. So right away, it's okay, what is that sweet spot? And I find that most of the top bands that have the ability to pick and choose are usually ending up in around the low 20s, you know? So like it's, I don't know that it needs to be a cap that's like really restrictive. Like we don't want to say, oh, grade 1 bands should only have 15 pipers and 6 snares. Like that's kind of prohibitive in my mind. But having a limit to the roster size would also get rid of, there are many examples of bands, I think, that will take a member in and put them on the roster without intending to have them play, because it means that the other band can't get them and potentially beef them up. And I don't know that happens as much in Scotland, but you see it a fair bit in North America.
Yeah, it happens over here for sure. Pretty confident in that one. And I think, you know, when thinking about these questions, Andrew, the big one came to me: how do you police the cap? So is it a competitive number and the roster is unlimited, or do you have to limit your roster as well? So to me, if it's going to work properly, you'd have to limit the roster as well. So if you're going to want, for number 18 on the park, I think having a roster of 21 would be reasonable, and that would allow for your strongest 18 to play. It still allows for competition within the band, and Alex knows that as well with leadership, that having competition for spots is always a healthy thing to have in a band. So, you know, the guys of the mega bands, the guys are always in the top 4 or 5 spots on a competition. They have competition for spots, and they'll tell their pipe players, we're going to play this number. And then you look around, you count the numbers and you go, well, there's 3 guys not making it then. And whether they're bluffing or not, that's the general sort of perception. But in terms of keeping it status quo, what we're seeing, I think, is a decline in numbers slowly, but it's happening. You know, maybe the pandemic might have had a bigger impact of that. We don't know yet, but looking at the draw for the first major, there's 10 grade 1 bands. And from the top of my head, I can think of 2 or 3 that have just not come out this year because of numbers. And it's all based around numbers. It's never, we're not sounding very good, we're not going out, because you guarantee with the leadership in place of these bands, they will get a good sounding band, but they don't necessarily feel that they're competitive with 12 to 14 pipers, unfortunately. and some bands are not willing to go out like that, and other bands are. So it really is. So I think there's some bands out there you could have a completely different conversation than you're having with Alex and I, and they'll tell you that it doesn't matter at all, and all these things. But I do feel, with status quo, if it stays the way it is, we're going to slowly decline more and more, and then you're going to end up, speaking purely on grade one, probably 8 bands that are going to really be able to survive without a feeder system or all these things coming through. You look at the feeder systems for certain grade 1 bands, and they're so vital for recruitment. And so recruitment can get, quite tricky. Alex, you know that more than I do, just with the amount of time you've had as well. But the location and finding players that are going to take your band forward can be really hard, and you have to look out with the sort of local area more times than not, just to find a gem of a player that you think, okay, they need work, but are they going to do that sort of thing? So that's what we're looking at when you're not in the mega bands. So, status quo is the mega bands probably love the way it is right now and are quite happy because they're getting recruit people, they're knocking down their doors to get into the band because it looks like there's a lot of people in that band, so it must be good as well. There's that, well, that's a popular thing. I want to be in that band, and if I make it, I'm better than quite a lot of those players as well. So it's a comparative thing as well. So, my opinion.
Yeah, really interesting. The pressure, it sounds like, you're recognizing the pressure to get the numbers out in the field to be competitive. And, Don Bradford at Lomond and Clyde, I think is an example, coincidentally, just decided to sit out the season. Quite frank about that, because it could have fielded a band, but it sounded like just doesn't have the numbers to be competitive. Now, David, are you feeling the same kind of pressure, or would you be of the mind to go out with a minimum?
I certainly wouldn't go out below like 16. I don't think that would happen. I think 16 would be my big cutoff if I wanted to feel like, my first year of being Pipe Major at Fife, I want to try to make as big an impact as I can. Numbers would be amazing. To me, 21 would be lovely. But, just the way the pandemic has been, and people who've had a couple of years out have decided, let's just take time away and maybe just call it quits. They've had a good run. They've not managed to get themselves up and running again, and they're not really interested. They realize they're not interested. And they also realize the level of the standard they need to be at to compete. And so a natural drop-off happened, and the guys who stayed are all really, really committed and wanting to do that. So it's finding the right person as well. But certainly, I think it's got to be still a quality-based. Am I putting out a really top quality band? And then is that band going to stand up against the bands with more numbers? And so you just don't know until you to really do it anymore. And I think it's a lot of it really stems from, what the judges are doing. You're seeing Inveraray win lots with less numbers. They didn't, it doesn't seem to be a factor for them at all. And so you could say it doesn't matter at all because they're doing really well. There's such as the quality of that band. I think there's no denying when they're on their day, the numbers won't matter because everything works in harmony, everything works in sync. The volume, it doesn't matter. They've got their own sound. They've established themselves. But as a band establishing themselves, it's hard to compete right away with bands big numbers. And I think that's probably, there's probably some pressure there to at least get bodies in again for things that happen on the day of a competition. Is your reed gonna go, your pipes done in or whatever? Accidents happen on the day, somebody knocks their reed, and you don't want to be down too little number for that either,
Yeah, and Alex, I guess that kind of gets back to the roster sort of idea rather than the strict numbers idea. Are you, but back to
Yeah,
the original question, the pressure, you being in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for those around the world who aren't familiar with Canada, it's a big country, and you're quite remote.
yeah.
So thoughts?
I think a lot of people aren't aware that, I mean, even in Halifax, it's quicker for me to get to Glasgow than it is to get to Vancouver. So we're about as close as you get. We're right on the Atlantic, but it is fairly geographically isolated. And there is a lot of pressure. I mean, we have to do a lot more training than I think your average grade 1 band to get people up to the standard, because we need local people, because I don't think anyone would argue that having a band that's strictly fly-ins, it's not typically feasible. What I'm seeing, and I feel like this will be ongoing, is, I mean, with the bagpipes being such a sort of an intimate instrument as far as potential COVID transmission, people are still pretty scared. And I mean, even for me, I have, my son's not even 1 yet. He's not able to be vaccinated. So it's like there's that level of uncertainty that just kind of puts people on edge. And not only is taking 2 years off from playing, really hard to get back to it, but if you also have people that are not totally sure they're ready to mingle with a group of 30-ish people, in a room where we're all blowing into these pipes and there's certainly vapors everywhere. I think that is going to have a fairly significant impact on the size of bands too, because people are going, well, I can play solos and I can avoid people, or I can just play for myself or play whatever. But if you're playing in a band, like, there needs to be quite a bit of trust. So I think that will continue to impact sizing too.
Yeah. And what about the standard? I think David, or actually you both talked about harmony and orchestration and things like that. I mean, if maximum numbers were put in place across all grades, would there be a negative or positive impact on that, those sorts of elements, creativity, the number of bands, standards in general?
I get the feeling that the number of bands, and I think the knee-jerk reaction to everyone for caps is that, well, I only want to play for Stuart Little. I'm not, if I'm the guy that's in that bottom quartile that gets kind of told I'm not going to be able to be on the roster, then I'm not playing. And it's like, well, then how much do you really love it? I think the people that love piping enough, like, it's easy to just say, well, no, this is where I want to play, and that's all I'm going to do. It's like, well, but, and Andrew, we were talking about this, like, a corporation is not typically going to admit that they think they can handle being taxed. Oh, it's this new tax. Oh, it's going to impact our productivity. It's going to impact the bottom line. It's like, sure, but is that really going to impact the overall product? And I think in general, if the players are being displaced, it will have a positive effect on piping in the medium to long term. And I think short term, you have sort of the emotional effect of, this is my band and I don't want to go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But I think, as far as I do believe, I guess, to put it out there, I believe there are more pros and cons, but I don't think it's not black and white. There's going to be an impact on both sides.
David, any further thoughts on that?
It's pretty, very, very much on par with Alex on this one. I think the quality of bands will, in general, it's hard to know. It's people taking on bands. If they're going to increase bands, who's going to take the band on? Is there enough people who want to be the pipe major of a band as well? And how does that? Are we getting? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, not much further than what Alex had to say. Really, it's pretty bang on.
Well, it's interesting. It's the task of being, especially in grade 1, the higher the grades, of assembling enough players and drawing them in, and it becomes a full-time sort of occupation for leaders, with leading drummers and pipe majors, I would think. What about associations? Associations don't seem to want to take any kind of stance or opinion or tackle this issue at all, that at least that we're seeing. And, you know, maybe they're waiting for their members to pipe up. I don't know. But, you know, do they have a responsibility to go out there and find out, to poll what their members really want, and then act accordingly? You know, and or should it be decided at, by the bands that are flush with players and really successful and kind of might be blockading sort of this idea of a maximum?
I think the association,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I think the association has to take a stand, because the bands that are the most influential are also the ones that I would say would benefit the most from things remaining as they are, because they're flourishing in their current environment. I can see that the association would benefit from not doing it, because then there's potentially less memberships, there's less people through the gate, there's less people supporting the burger van. There will be a bit of a trickle down effect, but it's, again, that's short versus medium to long term. So if there may be a short-term impact, but is that going to mean that in 10 years, instead of there being 10 grade 1 bands at the first major, we're back to 17 or 18? I would guess probably. I mean, I don't, and those numbers are arbitrary, but I do believe that, you know, it would result in short-term pain for sure, and people being displaced. Like, that's where you kind of have to take the it's not personal aspect of it. Like, me saying this, it's easy for me to say it as a pipe major that wouldn't really be impacted by there being a cap, because that's just going to mean that it's a little bit easier for me to kind of get to the same level or size, not level necessarily, but get to the same size and having a clear guideline. I also think it's kind of silly that if they're going to continue to have no maximum, then there really shouldn't be a minimum, because that seems to police itself anyway. But having these like, oh, well, you need to have at least 8 pipers in grade 1. It's like, no, you don't. You know, you kind of, David's exactly right. Like, under 16, like that's really impact, like the amount, even the volume of your band, it's going to be really hit. So
Yeah. David, thoughts about associations and, you know, kind of polling their members, all their members, not just grade 1, but, you know, everybody for their sort of attitudes. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree to an extent that, yeah, of course, the association's there to serve the members, and the members need to kind of lead that, I think. I'm not sure that the association, especially, well, being involved a little bit with the RSPBA, I'm not sure they don't listen. I'm not sure I mean, any rule change that's been proposed usually goes through. So I would actually think, if, you know, maybe if the RSPBA bit the bullet and just went, no, we're just going to make the call, forget about the bands would have the choice to vote on it. So, but the question has been asked before and nobody was really keen, but I'm not entirely sure who they all asked, if it was everybody. But I mean, if you're looking at the numbers game, I mean, we're talking like the big bands, but like, you know, Alex, we've got 5 big bands who probably have more than 21 players in grade 1. And so you're like, okay, cut that to 21. Say they've got 25 players, there's 4 players from each band. We're talking about 20 players. You're going to get 1 band out of this. I'm not entirely sure, and that's across the globe as well, because I'm including SFU in the 78s. You know, there's bands that are bigger how many players will trickle and actually make another band out of it? I'm not entirely sure that would happen. However, it's the perception of what we're trying to do. What's the end goal? I'm not sure the associations know entirely what the end goal is that they want from this. What do they want? Is it to be more even, or is it to create more bands? So if they don't have a clear idea of why this is beneficial, and nobody can really do it unless we try it, you know, we could do the whole trial cap thing, see what happens, and I don't know if that would work. We'd maybe see a little bit of an impact, but unless they have a clear idea what the end goal is that they're trying to achieve, more membership, more bands, more fees, more, then if it's got to be beneficial to the association as well as just the bands, because at the end of the day, they're running a business.
Yeah. Excellent points. Okay, why don't we wrap up this part here? We'll return with part 2 and maybe talk a little bit about minimum numbers, and then also talk about the community aspect of pipe bands and how this kind of affects the localization of players and fly-ins and the rest of it. So we'll be back with part 2. Stay tuned.